On December 1st of 1987, Andrew Gustafson kissed his wife Priscilla and their children goodbye as he left the house around 7 a.m. The Gustafson family was a bit on edge after the recent break-in to their house, but spirits were still high. Andrew was a lawyer, and he was negotiating an important real estate deal that day. A business associate had offered him a stake of ownership in a hotel, and closing the deal would be a huge success for him. Priscilla worked as a preschool teacher at a nearby church. The two had been high school sweethearts before they settled down in Townsend and had their children, Abigail and William, who were 7 and 5 years old, respectively. Priscilla and the children didn't have to leave the house nearly as early as Andrew, but they got up early so they could all have breakfast together as a family. After hours of paperwork, the deal was a success. Andrew called Priscilla at around 3:30 p.m. He wanted to tell her the good news and have her get a babysitter so the two could go out and celebrate. But Priscilla didn't pick up. Concerned and reminded of his apprehension about the recent break-in, he called a few more times before he got off work. When he got home at around 5:20 p.m., Priscilla's car was in the driveway, but there were no lights on in the house. The Gustafsons had already decorated for Christmas, and the festive lights outside were still lit up. But it was already dark out, and the indoor lights should have been on too. Andrew opened the door, and as he later recalled, quote, "I went in the kitchen door and turned on the lights. Then I called out for anyone at home. Nobody answered. So he picked up the landline and called their babysitter, thinking perhaps his family was there. But the babysitter told him they hadn't seen his family that day or heard from Priscilla about possibly watching the kids later." Andrew later said, quote, "Then I knew I had to search the house." On October 9th of the following year, Andrew would give the following account to a tearful jury about what he had found in his house. Quote, "I went into the bedroom and turned on the lights and saw my wife face down on the bed, dead. I screamed and went downstairs to call 911. He'd maintained his composure until he described finding Priscilla. He said he knew she was dead right away because, quote, she was lifeless and had the gray pallor of death to her hands and feet. He then went back upstairs and took a closer look, saying, quote, then I felt I had to go up again, and I looked again, and that's when I saw the 2 bullet holes in the pillow that was over her head. When the prosecution later asked if he had searched the house for Abigail and William, he said, quote, no, I was afraid of finding them dead. The police log for Andrew's 911 call read, quote, Mr. Gustafson called requesting an officer at 3 Saunders Road. Believes his family is all dead. This, as reprinted in the Boston Globe, said the note was in at 4:21 p.m., which is possibly an error, as most accounts say Andrew returned home at 5:20. Officer John Johnson was one of the first on the scene. He consoled Andrew in the kitchen after checking Priscilla for a pulse, and when the next officer arrived to stay with Andrew, he began searching the house. He found William upstairs in the bathtub, dead, though there was no water in the tub. Abigail was downstairs, her lifeless body face down in roughly 4 inches of water. When the officer told Andrew what he had found, quote, Mr. Gustafson let out a cry of anguish and put his head down and cried. At this point in time, Mr. Gustafson was escorted to the front of the house, placed in a cruiser, and taken to the end of the driveway. Hi, I'm your host, Zach Williams. Welcome to Compulsion. Local papers were quick to release details about the case. So much so that some readers complained about the gruesome details released about the deaths of the Gustafson family. In the bedroom, they found knotted ties, socks, and stockings to indicate Priscilla had been tied up. There was evidence she'd been sexually assaulted. A pair of men's underwear was found in the closet that Andrew said did not belong to him, and there was a part of a condom found on the bed. There were bloodstains found throughout the house and torn pages from a pornography magazine in the kitchen wastebasket as well. The attacker had apparently made some effort to cover up the assault. Priscilla had been redressed shortly before her death. Witnesses confirmed that the outfit she was found in was not the outfit she had been wearing earlier that day. They found Priscilla's underwear in a closet, and it looked like it had been torn off. In the closet, they found a knotted sock that had blood and saliva on it, indicating that it may have been used as a gag. There was also a green shirt found that had been torn that one witness later identified as the one Priscilla had been wearing earlier that day. The children had both struggled with their attacker. Abigail especially had put up a fight, and as a result suffered blunt trauma to the head and compression of the neck. Though police were quick to assume the murders had been the result of a robbery gone wrong, nothing was stolen from the house. The pillow that had been placed over Priscilla's head was found outside near the chimney. One of the flower beds nearby had very clear shoe prints in it, and just above the shoe prints was a space on the outside of the house where the Gustafson family nameplate had been torn off of the siding. Just like in the first part of our story, accounts differ on how exactly the evidence was collected. During pretrial testimony, lead detective Joe Lawless said that he had noticed the shoe prints under the missing nameplate. William May claimed in the news that it had been him that noticed the missing nameplate. Either way, a K-9 unit was called in. Joe Lawless was the officer mentioned in our first episode about the case. He was the lead detective who interviewed with Investigation Discovery. His testimony would occasionally conflict with that of the other officers. After this, Detective Robert Hippler took a K-9 tracking dog named Mike to examine the outside of the house. The dog sniffed the pillowcase that the attacker had put his hand in to fire the gun and quickly led the handler into the woods. The dog followed a strong trail for a bit, but quickly startled a pair of skunks. This was around 1 a.m., and Hippler decided to stop for the day and resume the next morning, as the skunks could ruin the scent trail if the dog got into a skirmish with them. The next day, another K-9 unit was brought in, and the tracking dog Spike quickly led State Trooper Cleveland Coates further into the woods. When Coates would later testify in court, he said that he followed the dog through the woods, a distance of about 3/4 of a mile, to the LaPlante family home. The dog was walking up to the front door, and Officer Coates stopped Spike just a few feet short of the door. During the first or second day of the search, Officer Sean Baxter spotted something unusual on a pile of rocks near a barbed wire fence at the edge of the woods. There was a folded-up shirt on top of the rocks. Baxter unfolded the shirt and found the Gustafson family nameplate, as well as a pair of mismatched work gloves, one white, the other yellow. Some accounts say that the dogs initially alerted to this evidence, but reports differ on how exactly it was found. Joe Lawless's testimony conflicts with this. He claimed to be there for both K-9-led searches, but his account conflicts with what all of the other officers said in court. He said they stopped the search because it was too dark out, and he claimed that the shirt with the nameplate was found just outside the LaPlante family home, when there are more sources that claim this evidence was found right outside the Gustafson family home. He also implied that he had been first on the scene, when we know that this was not the case. It's important to note that his testimony was largely taken from a Boston Globe article. It is always possible that this testimony was misinterpreted by the reporter, but the Boston Globe did tend to be the more accurate and less sensationalist source. What this discrepancy meant is anyone's guess, and it doesn't change the evidence found. But we already know Lawless was the only officer who worked on the case who agreed to be on the previously mentioned Investigation Discovery episode. Perhaps while the case was still happening, he was a bit too eager to be in the limelight, and not as worried about reporting facts as accurately as he should have been. which just further complicates an already very difficult case. However the evidence was found, police already had reason to suspect LaPlante. He was one of 5 suspects in the area that had displayed, quote, bizarre behavior the last few years, and he was one of the suspects in the recent burglary at the Gustafsons' house. However, northern Massachusetts did have its fair share of violent crime, and it didn't necessarily have to be a local suspect. A few unsolved murders and disappearances a decade before actually had people speculating that there was a serial killer in the area, the most notable of which happened in 1973. Judith Vuig was a 31-year-old teacher who was murdered in her home on Main Street, about 200 yards from the Gustafson home. Newer articles about this case have said that Vuig lived on Saunders Road, but this is not true. This error was just one of many that would be reported in later articles about the Gustafson murders and the crimes in Townsend preceding them. The murders were all over the news, and police were asking the public to come forward if they knew anything. They weren't putting all of their stock in LaPlante as a suspect, but he was absolutely looking to be the most likely one. The Boston Globe noted several, quote, ritualistic similarities between the Gustafson murders and the Pepperell break-in. There was a bottle of beer that had been opened but not drank in the Gustafson house, and in the Pepperell house there were 2 glasses of wine that were poured but untouched. The police set up shop at the LaPlante house, and when Stephen returned home from classes that day, there were 2 troopers in the family driveway. He told them he hadn't been aware of the Gustafson murders. He answered their questions, told them they could search his car, and then they left to question Daniel. Trooper Stephen Matthews went to go question Daniel around 2 p.m. Daniel was at the library studying with his tutor in the children's room of the building. When Matthews first approached him, he said, quote, "Hey, I'm not a bad guy." Matthews later testified in court that LaPlante had spoken calmly but was sweating. Quote, "He was jumpy, edgy. He appeared nervous. Along his mustache line, he developed sweat. His voice was calm, but his body seemed nervous to me." LaPlante said he'd been home watching TV for all of that afternoon and only left the house very briefly around 10 a.m. He was planning on grabbing a chainsaw from the backyard to cut up some wood, but the shed was locked, so he decided to do it later. He said he hadn't heard of the deaths until he saw a story about it on the news at around 11 p.m. the previous night. When asked if he had heard anything unusual, he told them that around 3 p.m. he had heard a car door slam outside and had heard some yelling. He said that other than going to the tool shed, he didn't leave the house until around 6 p.m. when he went to nearby Fitchburg with his family to attend his niece's birthday party. He also claimed that he hadn't explored the woods behind his house in about 2 years. After he was questioned, LaPlante called his mother, Elaine Moore, who called Robert Casey, the family attorney who was already representing him for the Pepperell break-in. Casey told the Boston Herald that he was shocked to hear LaPlante was the suspect in the murders. Quote, "It really knocked me over. He has always been quiet and cooperative, and I've never had the least concern for my safety around him." Casey told Elaine to go get Daniel, bring him home, and refuse any further police questioning. Matthews went back to the LaPlante house around 5 p.m. He wanted to have Daniel come down to the middle school, where investigators from different jurisdictions had set up shop. But Elaine told him that she wasn't about to let Daniel go down there alone, and if he insisted on trying, he could talk to the family attorney over the phone. When Matthews spoke to Casey over the phone, Casey said, quote, "You have a warrant, trooper?" Matthews did not. Casey told them they didn't have the authority to question him without a warrant, and while the family was arguing with the police, LaPlante snuck out the back door and ran into the woods. Townsend is surrounded by woods, and the paths that run through them connect to different neighborhoods. The same pathways that LaPlante had used to select which houses to burglarize and get away unseen allowed him to evade the police while staying in town. That afternoon, he was sighted by numerous people as he wove in and out of the forest. Later that day, LaPlante broke into the McGovern family house. He was going through the house, trying to decide what was worth taking, when Lynn McGovern was getting home from work. She stopped before going inside. She didn't tell reporters exactly what, perhaps some movement in the house or something left disturbed, but she had a feeling someone was in the house. Lynn flagged down a cop who was out searching and asked him to take a look inside her house for her. When he walked inside, LaPlante jumped out of a second-story window, climbed down the garage, and escaped. Inside the house, Lynn found that a shotgun had been moved, a handgun had been stolen, and LaPlante had left his coat behind. 2 hours later, one Jonathan Lang went to answer the door and found LaPlante out front. LaPlante tried to pretend he was knocking under the guise of being a neighbor who wanted to discuss Lang's dog getting into his trash, but Lang had been watching the news and recognized him. Lang wasn't buying it, so LaPlante pulled out the stolen gun and asked to be let inside. But Lang shut him out, and LaPlante fled into the woods. Police searched through the night and patrolled the streets, but couldn't find him. The next morning, the students at LaPlante's old school, St. Bernard's, said a prayer for him. Police searched LaPlante's home and found a plethora of evidence to link him to the crime. They found a gun and clothes with possible evidence on them. There were spent gun shells in the basement of the LaPlante family home. A yellow glove, similar to the one found at the scene of the crime, was in LaPlante's room. They were able to tentatively match the sneaker prints to LaPlante's shoes, and they recovered 11 knives, some of which had Nazi imagery on them. For much of the day, heavily armored police had been checking wooded areas and following up on sightings in Pepperell and Townsend. The search consisted of dozens of officers from departments all over the area. Over 100 officers in total participated. Handlers with K-9 officers combed through the woods, while 2 police helicopters searched from the skies. Dozens of people gathered on the back roads to watch police search the woods. In Pepperell, LaPlante forced his way into the home of Pamela McKella, who would later recount her ordeal in court. LaPlante had broken in to search for food when she got home and surprised him. He held her at gunpoint while he, quote, got some juice and made some sandwiches. He asked her if she knew who he was, and she said she did. He asked her what was going on outside, and she told him the police were looking for him and that his face was all over the papers and the news. He asked her if it was about the Townsend murders, and she told him it was. Then he told her, quote, I didn't do it. He then asked her if she, quote, remembered December 8th last year, but she didn't know what he was talking about. During her later testimony, she was cut off from elaborating further, as the presiding jury did not know about the break-in charges. Pamela's phone rang at one point, and LaPlante held the gun to Pamela's head while she answered it, and pretended that everything was fine. It was her aunt calling to warn her that LaPlante was on the loose, and that she should lock her doors. She got her aunt off the phone quickly. Then she begged LaPlante to just take her car and leave her alone. But, quote, he said he couldn't because he didn't have a driver's license. The two took off in her car with Pamela driving and started heading toward Ayer. She noticed LaPlante seemed very distracted, so when she slowed down for a stop sign, she opened the van door and rolled out. She quickly got to her feet and was relieved to see LaPlante had taken over the wheel and was driving away from her. He drove to Ayer, where Officer Charles Nelson recognized the stolen van at around 5:04 p.m. Nelson pulled over the vehicle on Main Street, but LaPlante fled into a nearby wooded area. He reached the G.P. Morris lumberyard through the woods. He pointed a gun at one of the workers and told them, quote, to get out of there and not to say anything. Police knew the lumberyard was just on the other side of the narrow stretch of woods, so they sent forces over. 2 state police officers reached the lumberyard first and heard a rustling noise in one of the dumpsters. They peered inside and saw LaPlante crouching near the bottom. They quickly got out of the way and decided to wait for backup. They told him that it was over and that there was nowhere to go. One officer said, quote, Danny, you can't get out from in that dumpster. Come on out, it's over. Within just a few minutes, around 30 officers surrounded the dumpster. LaPlante climbed out, and then the police arrested him at around 6:30 that night. To briefly go back to the rumors surrounding the case, many modern sources, investigation discovery included, claim that LaPlante was laughing hysterically the whole time he was being arrested. This is not true. Numerous local articles refute that and claim that he surrendered peacefully. When they took him back to the station and had him change into different clothes, he confessed to having a handgun concealed in his underpants and a bullet in his sneaker. Robert Casey quickly showed up at the jail to represent him. He later said that LaPlante was very nervous and upset the night that he was arrested. Local residents who had been afraid to leave their houses rejoiced at the news. After they captured LaPlante, State Trooper Jerry DeCristofaro said, quote, "I'm sure a lot of people will be sleeping better tonight. It was very gratifying to catch him." The next day, LaPlante was shipped to Bridgewater to undergo psychiatric evaluations, and Andrew Gustafson led a small wake with close friends and family. The following day, the town showed up to mourn at the funeral for the Gustafsons. Before the service, Reverend Lund prayed to God to give him strength to get through the funeral and remain composed. He told the Herald that the Gustafsons had been a perfect, loving family. He remembered Billy being lively and friendly, and Abby having a lovely voice when she sang in the church choir. Around 350 people crowded into a tiny church to mourn the Gustafson family. The church was on the same grounds as the preschool where Priscilla had taught. Priscilla had a wooden coffin with two small white coffins on either side of her for William and Abigail. A handful of their classmates and Priscilla's students had come to mourn, so the crowd had many children in attendance. Andrew addressed the crowd. Though he was deeply religious, he cautioned against the common sentiment that, quote, everything happens for a reason. He told the crowd, quote, "Never ever say this was God's will. God loved us. He gave us each other. And I know that God is crying and mourning too." The common theme among speakers at the funeral was to remember the slain family by living a life that they would be proud of. Andrew said, quote, "Our love is greater and stronger than any hate or evil. Our only memorial that can be worthy of them is to love as they loved, freely and openly and fully. What Scylla and Abby and Billy and I had can never be taken away. Every day we kissed each other and hugged each other and told each other how much we loved each other." Reverend Neil Lund said, quote, "As a community, if we love Scylla and those kids, then what we've got to do is build a community of the same love that we felt for them." Both men spoke of letting good win over evil, and Reverend Lund emphasized that though they were at a funeral, they needed to focus on the good, on the community coming together in the wake of tragedy. Quote, "Darkness and fear are realities for us, but we don't find God in the darkness. God is in the light. And if we want to find God in these moments, we don't look to killing and to tragedy and to loss. We look instead to the healing and to the love and to the fact that we are here sharing this moment together. This is where we find God." To the press, Lund cautioned against making too quick of a judgment about LaPlante. He said, quote, "I think there's the beginning of some healing going on. But there's some anger too. But I'm afraid that now that we have someone to focus our anger on, that we may also be forgetting the due process of the law." While the community was mourning for the Gustafson family, LaPlante's parents spoke to the media to defend their son's innocence. On December 5th of 1987, the Boston Herald reported that Elaine and David Moore were both certain that Daniel was innocent. David said that when he learned of the murders, he told Daniel that he was definitely going to be the prime suspect because they lived so close to the Gustafson family home, and because of Daniel's extensive criminal record. He could understand why police would suspect Daniel, but he thought they were being hasty in their judgment. David said that he was a good kid, and Elaine told the Herald, quote, "I don't think he did it. You talk to anyone who knows him, and they'd say that he wouldn't do that. I'm supportive of my son all the way. He is not violent. He's a very gentle person. I believe he is innocent, and I'll stand by him. It's all up to a court of law now." He's no psychopath, like some have said. Elaine said that police caved to the pressure of the public and needed a quick arrest, so they went after Daniel because he lived close by. She said the only reason he ran away was because it seemed clear that the police were already convinced he did it. LaPlante's brother-in-law, Leo, did not think that Daniel was capable of what he was being accused of. He said LaPlante may have fled because, quote, he's scared because he just got out of the hospital about a month ago. After the murders, LaPlante was at Leo's daughter's 6th birthday party. Leo said that LaPlante arrived to their Fitchburg home at around 5 p.m. He wasn't acting unusual at all. He ate cake, socialized, tickled the birthday girl, and did not seem suspicious. His family's defensive words did little to slow down the trial by media that was well underway. The Boston Globe was surprisingly sympathetic at first. They urged the public not to decide LaPlante was guilty simply because he was already a known troublemaker. Robert Casey told them, quote, I've known the kid for 4 or 5 years now, and I have as much fear of him as I do my maiden aunt. I can imagine he's going to be painted as an ogre, but with me, he has always come across as a quiet, reticent kid. On the other hand, the Rutland Daily Herald described LaPlante as a, quote, greasy-haired, wild-eyed youth with a bad complexion and a sinister stare. Armchair experts were quickly brought in by various papers to diagnose LaPlante based on the alleged crime, and on what his neighbors and classmates had said about him. James Fox, a Northeastern University criminologist, said, quote, from appearances, he would fit the classic case of sociopathic or antisocial behavior. Being a sociopath simply means you're a bad person and you don't really care much about anything but yourself. Lacking a conscience is something you can't give someone a pill to cure. Child psychologist Larry Larson was also rather quick to label LaPlante a sociopath, saying, quote, he obviously was able to commit an atrocious act without any remorse, which often is the sign of a sociopathic personality. Larson also backed up what the public had been saying. He was surprised to hear that LaPlante had never been given any psychiatric treatment while he was in the detention center, and said it should have been clear that he could be a danger, and he should have been evaluated and helped. He said they should not have let him back out into society before being rehabilitated. While Andrew mourned the loss of his family, the public criticized the legal system for releasing LaPlante on bail. A December 7th Boston Globe article defended the decision. Officials told the media that they had no choice but to release LaPlante when bail was met. He was being held on a $100,000 surety or $10,000 cash bail. It took 10 months for Elaine to remortgage her house, and given that he was a child still living at home, the courts didn't overly think he was a flight risk. Locals were upset that LaPlante was allowed out on bail, but local officials reminded everyone that LaPlante had not yet been charged with anything, and that some states don't even allow juveniles to be held in a facility until their hearing date. Francis Bowen spoke with the media as well. Quote, I told them there is no reason why he should have been on the streets. It was an awful, awful thing they did. He said that the judge should have placed a higher bail and ordered some kind of psychiatric evaluation. He was shocked that Elaine had remortgaged her house to pay the $10,000 bond, and said, quote, and I couldn't believe the mother would put herself out like that because her son obviously needed help. She made a big mistake. She shouldn't have taken him out. Tina, on the other hand, just expressed her relief that he had finally been locked up. She said, quote, I don't have to walk down the street and look around to see when he's going to come back, or when I'm going to find him in my home again. The Herald asked Francis if he would consider moving back to his old house in Pepperell, as it had not sold yet, and LaPlante was locked up for good this time. Francis said that he probably would not consider a move back. He said he still harbors a lot of anger about the attack, and the fact LaPlante was let out again after trying to hurt his family. He told the Herald, quote, maybe I should have killed him. If he got out now, I'm going to kill him. That's how I feel. The press knocked on doors and asked people walking by the streets to give statements about what they thought about the crime and LaPlante. Neighbor James Jerry recalled when he had hired LaPlante to help clear his squash field of rocks and stones as a kid, and instead, LaPlante went around smashing the squashes. He said, quote, "I saw Daniel LaPlante grow up since he was a small boy. He was always troubled, but I never imagined this would be the grand finale of his life." Much of the town expressed their relief that LaPlante had been caught, but were not optimistic that the town could ever go back to the way it was. People were locking their doors now, and the school that Abigail and William attended brought in numerous counselors to ensure they could make time for every child. In an interview with the Boston Globe, the mother of one of Abigail's friends said her son was inconsolable. Quote, "Right now, I'm just trying to show him as much love as possible and show him that most people love kids. Most people, anyway." The sentiment, as expressed by disaster psychologist Jeffrey Mitchell, was that Townsend was, quote, "a small town that had a big city crime." Perhaps local Reverend Neil Lund said it best, quote, "Nothing will ever be the same for any of us, and yet nothing has changed. We get up each morning, we go to work, we still have our families, and yet, having lived through that trauma, none of us will ever see life in quite the same way we did before." While the town tried to move on, Andrew picked up the pieces of his life. He was a poet in his free time, and about 2 months after the death of his family, he wrote a series of poems for them, expressing his grief. The one he'd written for Priscilla ended with, "Oh, where is my Scylla, now that I need her? How much I love her, how much I miss her. My treasure is in heaven, but I'm here on earth. My life's without meaning, how little it's worth. I will go on living, I just don't know how. I will go on loving, I have to, somehow." He rented an apartment in Townsend for a few months, but decided to move back to his house eventually, later saying in an interview with the LA Times, quote, "I had to emotionally reclaim it. I had to go back in there and be all right. The house became a source of strength for me. With the memories of my family, the love that occurred there was much stronger than the death there." He said the first few months were the hardest, but he joined a support group for the loved ones of homicide victims and reclaimed his life slowly, going to dinner with friends and leaning on his support network at church. Quote, "First you sob all the time. Then you set goals, like you say, today I'm going shopping. You don't want to go out and deal with people, but then you go ahead and feel better because you did it." He returned to work, kept up with church activities, even more so as Priscilla had been so religious, and started to take charge of rebuilding his life. He even started moving away from the law practice he'd been working in and set his eyes on perhaps working in the juvenile system to help young offenders get back on the right path. Though he was grieving, he made it clear that he wasn't going to be consumed by his grief or get wrapped up in feeling sorry for himself. He told the LA Times, quote, "You always think, why me? But then you realize soon enough, why not me? If you live your life with your eyes open, you know life isn't fair." Music is provided by Hexsystem. Major sources for this episode include Parkaman.com, the Boston Herald, the Boston Globe, and the Nashua Telegraph. For a full list of our sources and links to our contributors, please see our show notes. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at CompulsionCast to stay up to date on our latest episodes and news. See you in 2 weeks. If you're looking for a true crime podcast with a different point of view, The Prosecutors is the one for you. Every week, Alice and Brett bring their unique perspective as prosecutors to the most famous cold case mysteries of all time. This podcast is about more than just the story. Alice and Brett will walk you through the legal problems lurking behind every case, breaking down the complexities of the criminal justice system with humor and a personal touch. And they do it without ever losing sight of the pursuit of justice, both for the victims and the accused. They stay focused on the case at hand, but they do it without being impersonal. But it's not just criminal cases. They bring the same training and approach they've learned as prosecutors to classic mysteries as well. They cover the Dyaltov Pass, the Hinker-Kaifik murders, and the death of Elisa Lam. The cases that keep you up at night. Murder, mayhem, disappearances, you name it. If it's true crime, Brett and Alice are on the case. Check out The Prosecutors wherever you listen to podcasts.